that in addition to the transatlantic slave trade, there were internal slave markets. So you actually had many women who may have started out, may have been born in the Bahamas, but by the time they would have reached full maturity, may have been to North America, may have been to South America, because slaves actually moved around. And again, I did mention that women are the pillars. So as a woman, when you are moving or being relocated, you are carrying with you those characteristics, those traits and things that you would have learned. So there is definitely a connection. And again, I think it stems back from Africa. And also on that, I met a colleague recently at Barry, she's Nigerian. And slavery started so many years ago, slavery ended. And there were so many similarities in this modern day Nigerian woman and this modern day Bahamian woman that we share. I never met her, I have never been to Nigeria. But there's so many similarities. And she's African. So yes, there is still that connection there. And there will always be that connection because again, our foundation as Black people begins in the continent of Africa. There was a diaspora where we moved throughout the world, throughout the region, and there were international slave markets. So slaves did move around. So yes, you may find a similarity between a Black Bahamian woman and a Portuguese Black woman. So that's very, very important. I don't think that many times discourses actually discussed how often slaves actually were transported within the internal slave market of the New World as well as, within the New World.
Yeah, and also the Portuguese were the first to go to Africa. So there may be a Portuguese influence very early on, carried on.
I wanted to know the correlation between like the impact of the Haitian Revolution and how, when they came about in 1804, how did it impact the slavery in the Bahamas? Because I know through my own research, because I studied, Atlantic history, the slavery, the Middle Passage, and what have you, and I wanted to know how did the slaves in the Bahamas react to the efforts by Toussaint Louverture to gain political freedom, because it was more or less suppressed, and because everyone was supposed to be free so much longer.
Well, with reference to that, plantation owners in the Bahamas, like the region, actually were very, very much afraid. And there was actually legislation that was implemented in the Bahamas to actually ban the trade of those slaves coming from Haiti, fear of the fact that they actually would influence Bahamian slaves to uprise. So there's definitely a connection in that. If you would like specifics in terms of it, find that I can get it for you. But in my research, there is definitely a connection there. And like I said, within the region, not just in the Bahamas, slaves were actually banned, and those who actually came here as slaves, they really didn't want them here, again, because they feared that they actually would in fact instigate incidences of riots. And many slaves who had heard about it, actually there were cases where they actually revolted or committed acts to try to garner a change. But the nature of the Bahamas meant it was very difficult to have successful revolts because we're not competitive. And particularly in the Family Islands, there was so much isolation and distance, but we did feel the impact of that, and legislation helped to curb that, and also the geographical dispersion of the islands made it a little difficult.
I'll just say Sean McQueenie addressed that, and I think Alfred says addressed that, and then after we have Roger, I'm sure if you're interested in that.
Yeah, so yeah, there's definitely information on that.
Yes, I wanted to ask, you have this concept of female dominance, and I wanted you to elaborate on contextualize that concept.
Well, with reference to that, the reason why I sort of highlighted that so much is because the fact that there was a distinct difference between the European perception of what a woman was. European men living in Europe knew women really were not as dominant. They were passive. Many of them, like Black women, were of course uneducated, but they had no active role in terms of their society. Whereas within Africa, at this period, which was unconventional by many scholars' account, women were actually making decisions. They were actually able to determine who became the next ruler. Many of them, even through marriage, are still able to advocate for their lineage and for their countries. women actually owned slaves, they owned property, they could be sued, which was something that was not conventional. And in some societies, they actually were able to vote. Now, like I said, in Africa, there's regional dispersion, so this was not throughout. And so, with that is dominant, that was different. And I think within Western society, as we develop, the role of the black woman, why I stress it so much, really became somewhat thwarted and distorted as a result of slavery. In slavery, we had where women actually within the home was a dominant force. Within the fields, they were actually producing more, much more dominant. But again, because from the Anglo-Saxon perspective, that was abnormal, and which is why we have so many stereotypes about women, because other women were not doing these things. And so that power there is something that has not really been discussed in a positive light. And so by saying dominance, what we were was so unconventional for that time. And as a result of the institution of slavery, and as a result of the psychological effects of slavery, I don't think that many of us have been able to embrace that, and many of us have been able to really internalize what that has meant to today's women. And so by going back and unearthing that and making the connection, then we can elucidate from the diaspora in Africa, from what we brought from slavery, to redefine ourselves. Because I think as women, we've allowed slavery and the perceptions to define who we are.
Quick one.
Well, there's a wealth of data with reference, yes, there's a wealth of data with reference to women in Africa. And again, like I said, most of what we've known in terms of beginning with history was written by Muslims. Those were really the pioneers in terms of who were exploring Africa, who were establishing cities. And part of it was really because they were trying to impart their religious perspectives. And so the Muslims, unlike many other religious bodies, tried to infuse their views with the local customs and cultures. So instead of just going in and saying, okay, well, we're going to burn until we don't convert, many of them actually sort of combined the peasantry or the activities of that community with Muslims. And they were the ones who really institutionalized or began transporting slaves and sharing information and taking it from region to region. So there is really a wealth of information. Now with the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, we actually see a shift in the views. And from my perspective as a researcher, I feel that from a Muslim's perspective, it was more neutral. But as slavery developed more and the psychological bondage became necessary to ensure the longevity of this particular trade, we saw where information on Africa itself became distorted to the advantage of the slave trade and what that meant for plantation economies. But there's definitely a wealth of information, and there is a library in here where many researchers actually go to get information on African history, and a lot of data is actually stored there. You'll find some information on Google. Eltis, Richardson, those gurus within the field in terms of researching African history and providing information on African women. Eltis? Yes. He has a lot of information, and so has Richardson, and again, most of it.
Insights from each other. I'd like to thank again for very, very good. And even more. As an educator, it's so good to see someone who's involved with research. I hope you're going to come back. So thanks again, and she's the only speaker that's ever provided refreshments.